All right. And basically, after what has now been a month hiatus, Matt, we're actually back. I mean, I told you during our last episode, Tears of the Kingdom, the new Zelda game, was coming out, and there was no way in hell I was going to have the time to actually get on and report another podcast over that period of time. And you know what? It actually worked out that way.
Yeah, I wanted to give you adequate time to play the game so you weren't distracted from our quest here of spreading the gospel of Bitcoin.
I consider this my what the main quest. I mean, you have a whole bunch of side quests during video games nowadays, and that's just all this shit coinery, right?
Yeah.
But you always have your main quest, and our main quest here is to promote Bitcoin, help drive Bitcoin mainstream, right?
That's right.
Now, I do have to say, we didn't get a recording done because of the game. I mean, obviously that did admittedly play a big part of it, but I mean, I was traveling so much over the last month, and you know what? I've got to say, one of the things that during that period of time, I mean, I got to go to the most happy fucking place on earth, Disney World, with my wife and in-laws. That was actually fun, I will say. But the best part of my time off was definitely going to Cartagena. Miriam and I, we went to Colombia for a couple of weeks, and it was my very first time in Latin America. And you know me, whenever I go anywhere, I don't actually really get any time off. So I started to go to some of the little local Bitcoin meetups in Cartagena. Unfortunately, they were all in Spanish, so it was completely worthless for me. But it really is an eye-opener being in these emerging economies, being in Latin America, being in these places of the world, and seeing how they are using Bitcoin. I mean, there were vendors on the street selling, I mean, mind you, it was like 120 degrees out, so what, 35, 40 something in Celsius. And people were selling bottles of water on the street using their Bitcoin wallets on their phone. It was astounding. So I thought, coming back for our first time together, I would invite who probably is one of the more noteworthy Bitcoin nomads, or at least one that I'm very, very close with, Alex. So maybe Alex, if you want to, and if you want to do a quick introduction for yourself, by all means, feel free to. But I mean, why don't you tell us a little bit about your Bitcoin story and how Bitcoin fits well in with your nomadity. I mean, I don't even know if there's a word for that, right? Just your nomad lifestyle.
Exactly, my nomadic lifestyle. So yeah, thanks for the intro. I'm Alex Lielacher. I'm the CEO and founder of Rise Up Media. We're a content marketing agency that works with Bitcoin businesses that are changing the world. In terms of my Bitcoin story, I first came across Bitcoin in 2011. I first bought Bitcoin in 2014, and I started working in Bitcoin in 2016. So I've been around for a while. It's been quite a crazy time, and I look forward to sharing.
I mean, you were there long before any of the first hype cycles.
Yeah, and I mean, what's interesting is that when I started working in Bitcoin in 2016, which coincided with me quitting my career in banking to go travel the world as a digital nomad and start working for myself, I was actually using Bitcoin essentially like as a currency because I had so I quit banking after 6 or 7 years in 2015 when I was in my late 20s. And then I did the typical thing that all the ex-bankers do. I went and fucked off to Thailand to go lie on the beach for a while.
Bangkok got them.
I had my laptop with me, and I was fully intent on doing the digital nomad thing, working remotely, building a career, working for myself. And sort of 6 months after I started that, I started working as a freelance writer pretty much immediately. And 6 months in, I had my first Bitcoin client. And at that point, I was getting paid in Bitcoin, and I had more than 50% of my income, which wasn't that much at the time because I was just starting out, but more than 50% of my income was in Bitcoin. So I was using a platform called Bitrefill to buy like mobile money, you know, whether I was in Malaysia or later I went to East Africa too. So I was using it to top up mobile money, and I would get my Bitcoin and I would exchange them into local currency or into mobile money using local Bitcoins. So local Bitcoins, one of the OG peer-to-peer marketplaces, unfortunately closed down, I think earlier this year. But for me, Bitcoin was like pretty much from the start a big part of my kind of nomadic lifestyle. And I think that that's something that's really picked up in the digital nomad scene, but also just for people that are working remotely and traveling a lot for professional reasons. People like you, Pat, going to conferences, traveling for family reasons,
Mm-hmm.
and there's definitely a lot of value of having Bitcoin on you when you're traveling halfway around the world. Because nowadays, getting your bank account shut not shut down, but getting your bank card blocked because you used it in a place like Colombia and you forgot to tell the bank that you're going to Colombia, and then you're suddenly there with no money. That's where Bitcoin could really help. And that's actually, it's funny because you mentioned Cartagena. I went to Colombia in, I think it was 2013, and back then I didn't have Bitcoin. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and there was no Bitcoin infrastructure to go to an ATM or anything like that.
I mean, was local Bitcoins even around back then? I don't think so.
I think it was around because I think local Bitcoin started in 2012,
Did
but
it?
it was
Okay.
like I wasn't active yet, and like I knew about Bitcoin. But I went to Colombia for like a week or something, and the first thing that happened is my bank card just it got blocked.
Mm-hmm.
So I was there, and then my other bank card had a little bit of money on it. I had an old student card from another bank, and it had a little bit of money, so I was able to pay the first hotel. But then I literally had no cash, and I was stranded by myself in Cartagena, actually. So it's funny you mentioned Cartagena. So I back then I had to call my dad, which is great when you're an adult, and I had to be like, hey, you need to like Western Union me money, and we
Mm-hmm.
all know what the fees
Oh,
are on Western Union. I mean, at the time I didn't. At the time I didn't care because I just wanted to have money so I could pay for the hotel. Uh,
right.
but but those are the kind of scenarios for which Bitcoin is great because nowadays like you said, you can go to a meetup, you can go to another peer-to-peer marketplace, and to be honest, you can use one of the like 35,000 ATMs, like Bitcoin ATMs that are scattered across the globe now. So I think Bitcoin has a lot of value add for anyone like traveling a lot, working remotely, and definitely for anyone who lives the nomadic lifestyle.
I mean, I would agree. I mean, so I remember, so when I got down there, I had one of my credit cards shut off. I think it was my Capital One credit card. We tried to buy drinks at the hotel after we had just shortly gotten there. And I mean, I didn't tell them that I was traveling. I mean, I travel constantly and I never have any issues with it. I don't know. I guess Colombia, Latin America raises a yellower, oranger, redder flag at whatever security monitoring systems they have relative to going to London for the weekend or something like that. So I get it. Ironically, my German card worked perfectly fine. I guess you have a whole bunch of old Germans down there in Latin America, but that's neither here nor there.
Whoa, whoa! I'm
But
not
I
getting
remember
that.
thinking, I mean, I remember,
What
I
are you
remember,
implying?
I guess that's Argentina, not Colombia, right? Um,
That is
but I remember,
Argentina, yeah.
Migration.
but one of the things that was actually really funny about being in Cartagena, and we only learned this because we wanted to naturally tip our waiters and waitresses and tip the bartenders. They actually prefer to receive their tips not in the local currency, which I think is peso. They wanted their tips in dollars, or some of them even wanted it in Bitcoin. And this it kind of makes me think of one of the books that was written recently, Check Your Financial Privilege. I forget the author. You might know the author's name, Alex.
Alex Gladstein. I think
Yes, Alex
it
Gladstein.
was Gladstein, wasn't it?
Yeah, I do believe it was. And the premise of this book was, I mean, we think of in the West, most predominantly North America and Europe, as Bitcoin as purely a speculative asset, which, let's be honest, for what it is, that's largely where it drives its value from right now. We're speculating that it will become a global circular currency. Um, However, people that live in these emerging economies, areas where there's massive inflation, and we're reading every day about how that's been happening in a lot of Latin American countries, none more notably than Argentina lately, but for the last decade, Venezuela, where they've experienced legitimate hyperinflation. And the reason that I learned Bitcoin is starting to become a little bit more adopted in Colombia is because you have all of these Venezuelans trying to escape their country. A lot of them are coming to Colombia and setting up shop. And the only way they can transfer their assets, transfer any money or bolivar, I guess it was called, that they had cross border is in Bitcoin or in Tether. They want it tied to the US dollar. which I found to be fascinating. And because of that, you have all of these local marketplaces that are now adopting Bitcoin as payment. And this is where I think we in the West need to, I hate using that expression, but check your financial privilege, because you don't truly understand what the use case is of Bitcoin until you're actually in these places.
That's really interesting, man. Like, that just further pushes, I think, the theory and the philosophy that Bitcoin really does represent sort of like a freedom in that regard. Because I definitely don't feel that way in terms of, you go some places like Mexico and Canada, if you go close to the border, they definitely take the American dollar, especially if the exchange rate is good. But if you go anywhere else, man, like it's hard, and that sort of like limits you unless you make adequate plans for it. So that's really interesting to hear.
And I will say the global financial system has become a little bit more friendly over the last 10, 15 years. I mean, ever since I graduated high school and used to try to travel abroad, compared to where it is today, it's easier to travel with US dollars and have it exchanged somewhere else. It's easier to travel with euro and have it exchanged somewhere else. That has justifiably been not fixed, but made better over the last 10, 15 years, I would say. But when you have a global payment system that Bitcoin represents that can immediately settle for fractions of the cost, even for micropayments, depending on which app you use, I mean, that just is a complete game changer. So, I mean, Alex, you've been this kind of digital nomad. I mean, I think you're currently residing in Africa. I mean, what is the African scene related to Bitcoin and crypto that you're currently seeing? Is it something similar to what I experienced for my very brief time in South America? Is there other occurrences that are happening there? I mean, what's going on in Africa?
So, I mean, in Africa, from my experience, it definitely depends on which country you're in. So a good example is in Kenya. You've got an extremely well-functioning mobile money called M-Pesa, which I think has something like 80% or more, 90% penetration, because you can use it on smartphones, but also on these on like the simple phones. I forgot what they're called. So in a country like Kenya, we have functioning mobile money. You don't really need Bitcoin as a currency. And I mean, the Kenyan shilling has been getting slaughtered lately, but for the most part, if you look at the last sort of like 15, 20 years, it's been fairly stable. So here in Kenya, you've got Bitcoin being used mainly as an investment and a little bit for remittances, but it's mainly an investment. So from what I know from my Kenyan friends in the Bitcoin community, people invest in land and they invest in Bitcoin. So that's the big thing here. But then if you look at countries like, if you look at South Africa, for example, South Africa does not have functioning mobile money because it has a fairly well-developed financial services industry. So you have tons of ATMs, and the people that can afford to have bank accounts, they all use debit cards. They go to the cash machine and they can take out cash. So you've got essentially the debit cards and cash that are being used. And what you can also do in South Africa is if you're South African, you have a bank account, you want to pay a guy in cash, you can essentially transfer the money and they take it out at an ATM from you. So it's almost like a cash deposit that they can take out. But they don't have mobile money. So in South Africa, using Bitcoin as money that you can safely carry around, because you don't have to carry around cash, and crime is an issue in most parts of Africa, is super valuable there because they just don't have functioning digital money. So like two very contrasting use cases. Also, South Africa has currency controls. That's another thing for sending money abroad. Then if you go look in Zimbabwe, where they regularly introduce their own like Zimbabwean dollar or some kind of local currency that they try to fictitiously peg against the US dollar. There just as a store of value to put your money in, but also for cross-border payments, especially for businesses. Bitcoin and also stable coins are extremely valuable because in Zimbabwe, it's a similar scenario to Venezuela. So yeah, it really depends on the country because the use cases differ. But I like the point that you made that if you look at Europe and at the US, Bitcoin is really an investment asset, maybe also like a savings tool, depending how you look at it. But if you go into emerging markets countries, like using it for remittances, using it for online payments, if you're in a country like Nigeria, there's no PayPal in Nigeria. So
Hmm.
I worked with a freelancer in Nigeria who was based in Lagos for a long time, and I always paid him either in Bitcoin or in stable coins, depending on what was coming in from the clients, because there was no other way I could really pay him.
Yeah, and that's become a lot more popular lately, using money to kind of pay for digital nomadic freelancer services. Yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
100%. If you're located, like even the Ukraine, I mean, the Ukraine now obviously is at war, but prior to that, there was also no PayPal in Ukraine. Like
mm,
I think that's one of the reasons why Bitcoin and crypto, you should say, are quite big in Ukraine, because you just don't have the standard digital payment providers active there. So you just need to use Bitcoin and stablecoins.
I mean, I remember last year during the start of the Russian-Ukraine war. Um, I remember seeing the Ukrainian exchanges and the Russian exchanges. There was a severe premium of Bitcoin trading relative to Tether or USDT compared to every other country on earth. And there was a mass flight because everyone was so worried in that local domicile, Russia or Ukraine, about what the war would inevitably mean for their currency, especially when you had the US threatening to cut Russia off from the SWIFT system. I mean, if I'm just a blue collar worker in Russia, I mean, I don't probably care too much about whatever my government does. I mean, Russia's such a big place. I can't imagine their government really impacts them all that much. But I mean, hey, if I'm worried about what's going to happen to my ruble, I mean, I got to get out of it and I go to Bitcoin. And these people were paying a massive premium. I think I remember it being something like 20% over a 24-hour period after the war started, right? I mean, it's just absolutely crazy when you
Yeah, I
start
mean
to think about it.
that's where you really see like the power of Bitcoin and decentralized digital currency, is that in these extreme crisis situations, like same with Ukrainian refugees, like from one day to the next, the entire banking system fell apart. So the people that were able to put their money into Bitcoin or Ethereum or stable coins, had their USB stick or their phone and fled across the border and were able to some extent start a new life uh, in safety from putting their money into digital currency. So, and same, I like that you mentioned the Russians. I mean, when the war started, so many Russians that were working for U.S. companies were just immediately fired,
Yeah.
and all their international payment providers were pretty much switched off. So in those situations, what you can do is you can start, freelancing again, and the only way you can get paid is outside of the traditional payment systems, which leaves you with Bitcoin and stable coins. So yeah, we do need to
Exactly.
check
And
our financial privilege in Europe and America, because like a lot of the real big use cases for Bitcoin are outside of the Northern Hemisphere.
yeah, the Northwestern Hemisphere, to be honest. I mean, so you start to see. I mean, but this is also one of the reasons why politicians attack Bitcoin. This is why you have the Senator Karens, Elizabeth Warren, going out of their way to try to say Bitcoin is used for nothing other than money laundering, because she considers a person in Russia, a person in Ukraine that is maybe not Ukraine because she's politically corrupt, but they see people that are just living in any country, just randomly pick one, that is worried about the status of that country's economy because of what could be a global military conflict, or at least a geographical military conflict. And they're moving their money out of something that can be seized. They're moving money out of something that can be severely inflated, effectively made worthless, and into an asset that is hard, an asset that is decentralized, peer to peer, that cannot be controlled by any centralized figure, such as a government, for sanctions or for whatever other tariffs or impositions that the United States may put on a country like Russia. And I look at this and say, like, okay, fine, you don't have to necessarily politically agree with anything Russia is doing. God knows I don't. But you have to at least realize that the populace of that country, the people that live there, they're just trying to protect themselves. And it's unfortunate what ends up happening to these people. They become victims of international foreign policy that's kind of just forced upon them. And Bitcoin is the way out. I mean, I hate saying it, but it's unequivocally true. The more the world goes to shit, the more governments, frankly, fuck up, the better off Bitcoin ends up becoming in the end. Maybe not necessarily from a price standpoint. I don't care about where the price of Bitcoin necessarily goes, but from a fundamental value standpoint, because it can't be seized.
What? So you mentioned, Elizabeth Warren and the foreign interest and why she would be anti-crypto for those reasons, but why are sort of the Democrats in America largely against crypto? I mean, I understand why the Republicans tend to lean more pro-crypto, but now with all this like regulatory crackdown in America, which apparently, from what I've read, comes more from Democrats, like why are they so anti-crypto in America?
So I have a lot of speculative reasons that would border on conspiracy theories as to why.
I'm sure you have a couple of reasons.
Well, we're just guessing here, so.
Yeah. Okay, now the podcast is getting fun. So there are, I think we should say, a lot of Democrats out there that do like Bitcoin, that do like crypto. I don't think it's fair to generalize that the Democrats or anybody that would be more liberal, left-leaning inherently hate crypto, because typically these are the people that are they're more about inclusion. They're more about financial diversity. So Bitcoin and crypto, to a certain extent, strikes a chord with certain members of that party. I do think that's true. Similarly, I don't think it's fair to say any and all Republicans are more favorable of Bitcoin and crypto. There are those that are very much against it. Donald Trump he hates Bitcoin. He thinks it's fool's gold, or I forget what he actually called it. I mean, he basically thinks that Bitcoin is just a complete scam. And he's, for better or for worse, the leader of the Republican Party. Maybe, yeah, right now. But there are those on the right that really identify with Bitcoin because it offers a more it's a more liberty financial system. Because the assets cannot be seized. It's out of the control of government, and typically the right or conservatives are more restrictive around what they want from a government perspective. The left, certain factions of the left, are very pro big government, which is really funny when you think about it, because the 60s and 70s, it was the exact opposite, right? But you have the left that is very pro big government, and they hate anything that they cannot control. And we have to remember, most of these people are what we would call East Coast liberals or New York Democrats, which are really moderates at the end of the day. They're very pro business, pro banking, however, still socially proactive. They're still socially liberal. These are the groups that are really anti-Bitcoin and crypto, because I think they are, with banks as their big donors, being pushed this way. And if you're a government like the US, whose frankly only existence right now is predicated based on the success of the US dollar as the global reserve currency, if that fails, the debt that they've rung up comes due and they can't repay it. The country goes to hell. I think that is one of the reasons why certain factions of the government are being weaponized against Bitcoin and crypto, like the SEC, not really the CFTC. It really is just the SEC, but even the IRS is targeting crypto to a certain extent. I mean, we can really start going down that rabbit hole if we want to. But I think it has a lot to do with a more general statement that governments don't like what they cannot control. And Bitcoin,
I agree with that,
is inherently uncontrollable.
I mean, me being the layman here, that's been like my conspiracy theory all along, with not just Bitcoin, but anything. Like the way Bitcoin sort of fails in this regard compared to like your global or like US dollar or any of your currencies, is that there's no lobbyists for these big banks with Bitcoin. Like there's no centralized like people that are lining people's pockets to form policy. So that's, you got to get on that.
We had people in crypto that were lining the pockets of politicians, that one of which was the second biggest donor to Joseph R. Biden in his own campaign. And that was Sam Bankman Freed, SBF of FTX, donated over $50 million to the Democrats. I think it was just $50 million in the midterm elections. I think he actually donated more than that to Biden's presidential campaign years before. Turns out he was just a complete fraud. But yet he made all those donations, and we wonder why he was the one that was in the room with Gary Gensler at the SEC trying to pass crypto legislation that he was trying to effectively. I mean, Sam Bankman-Fried basically went full, what was his name? One Trip from Pan American Airways, trying to create a legal monopoly over crypto. And he was doing
Then you
it
see what
because he was
happened, though.
lining the
Like,
pockets.
but you see what happened with that.
Yeah, he
like
ended
the
up-
crypto community, like, did not. You guys like didn't accept that. Like, you're not going to let that shit happen. You know.
Well, until it was outed as a fraud, Sam was by a lot of people in the industry considered a hero. He was the guy that built the crypto trading platform by traders for traders. His exchange for some time did have the deepest liquidity. It had some of the best coins that were out there. It had the best derivatives platform, like bar none. So he was a hero for some time until, well, we learned it wasn't a Ponzi scheme. It was just flat out fraud. I mean, calling what he did a Ponzi would actually be, I mean, it was wire fraud. It was every sort of fraud you can possibly imagine. And he was the guy that was closest to the politicians. So this is where, now that it turned out that way, I think certain elements of the government, certain politicians are being overly critical of Bitcoin and crypto because they can point to this and say, this is why we're doing it. This is why we have to go after these people. And what I try to remind everybody is that the failure of FTX, the failure of Sam Bankman-Fried, had absolutely nothing to do with crypto itself. It had everything to do with lack of transparency over an overreaching, highly centralized agency, which was FTX, that had minimal oversight. And I don't mean oversight from a regulatory standpoint. I mean oversight from a traditional governance standpoint, even internally with a corporation. It just wasn't there. And this is the same problem that we see rampant running through banks. It's the same problem that we see rampant running through every Enron and every corporate scandal, every Tyco out there. It's more of a story of corporate fraud than it is crypto being a scam, in my view.
So I don't use that same argument against like corporations that they use against why Bitcoin needs to be regulated. Like, why is it just they seem to just attack Bitcoin? I guess because it's relatively new, but you know, I see stuff in the news. I mean, like I said, I'm a layman. I'm an idiot to a lot of extents, and I'm probably going to say a lot of shit that's not even correct. But it seems like they let these guys get away with murder, whereas they come for the Bitcoin and the crypto for no reason. I don't know. Just doesn't seem right to me.
Do you think, Pat, that as more banks start to adopt Bitcoin and provide sort of Bitcoin financial products, like you see with Fidelity, for example, and some of the online brokers, do you think that will change the tide in regulations, in crypto regulations in the US, or do you think we're just way too far off from that happening?
I think I have a different opinion now compared to the opinion I may have had even 6 months ago. And I think a lot of that has to do with I think a lot of that has to do with the clear purge that we've seen executed by the Federal Reserve and the FDIC over banks that were offering Bitcoin and crypto related services, no more so than Signature, Silvergate, and even SVB, Silicon Valley Bank, to a certain extent. While SVB was not necessarily a crypto bank, it was banking a very sufficient amount of crypto clients. And these were banks that, I mean, God, we could probably have a whole nother podcast on my views as to exactly what happened with the Fed hiking rates so quickly. But if we're going to put on our tinfoil hats, if we're going to be loyal to the foil right now, I mean, we could certainly say that there was... We're going to be loyal to the foil for a second here. There was a clear push against crypto Bitcoin friendly regional banks during that purge. They're the only ones that truly went under, and they went under in spectacular fashion, when in reality, they were actually reasonably liquid. Even SVB was reasonably liquid. It just was stupid enough to try to go out and raise capital because it had like a 2 billion loss on a bond portfolio or something stupid like that. Basically a signal effect to the market. And now what ended up happening is you have politicians like Senator Karen turning around and pointing to Reddit, pointing to crypto Twitter as the reason why these banks failed, because we created the bank run because of the rumors that were circulating on Twitter. It's just asinine. So if you had asked me a couple of months ago, I would have said absolutely yes. That more banks adopting crypto services, more banks offering crypto banking custody to clients, that would be a huge driver of adoption, not necessarily for people like me and probably not like you, Alex, where we truly believe that your keys, your crypto. If you're private keys and you're custodying your assets somewhere else, it's no different than, it's seizable. It's no different than if you put money in a bank. I think that is true with the Bitcoin as well, because, hey, they're not your keys. If you put your custody in Coinbase and there's a subpoena against you for whatever reason, and the IRS wants to freeze your assets, Coinbase is certainly freezing your assets. There's nothing you can do about it. And that's what I loved about what Jesse Powell did over at Kraken whenever they were seizing the Canadian truckers' financial assets. And they were trying to go after Bitcoin because Bitcoin became the means to donate to the Freedom Truckers or Trucker Freedom or whatever those people called themselves. Jesse told them, like, look, if you're doing this via Kraken, don't. And get your coins off of Kraken, because if the Canadian government says we have to turn over those assets to them, we have no choice. We are centralized. We're a choke point. Get your assets off our exchange. And I commend him immensely and respect him and admire him for saying that. Now, would it drive adoption? Yes, because I do think you're going to have lay people, like Matt always likes to remind us that he is, that don't necessarily trust themselves with the technology, but would rather have a third-party service like a bank or a custodian that they're familiar with that offers them those services. And institutions themselves, larger financial institutions, we have to remember, if you're an institution, all you want to do is divert liability elsewhere. You want to divert any risk elsewhere. And if you're housing your clients' assets on your own, rather than diverting that risk to a fund, to a manager, or to an RIA or somewhere else, that's just potential liability that you're going to have to answer for your shareholders, or you're going to have to answer to insurance companies whenever something goes wrong. And they're going to want to avoid that, which is why they also need those types of banking services.
Yeah, I mean, you make a really good point, because they did. You make a good point, because with Silvergate and SVB, like it really looked like they were going after the crypto banks, and a lot of people in the crypto community who are a bit closer to the subject matter said that that's the case. That was very deliberate and very political. I just wonder when Goldman and Morgan Stanley and JP comes out and they start, Bitcoin futures, Ethereum futures trading desks,
Yeah.
and when they start selling sort of like financial products on top of Bitcoin or Ethereum, like the ETPs and stuff like that, or Bitcoin ETFs, to their customers, both like the high net worth individuals, retail, and institutions. I just think at that point the banking lobby would turn and say to the regulators, hey, like we actually want to have Bitcoin and Ethereum as assets that we can trade, because we can make money with this. And we know that in most countries, the banking industry tends to kind of dictate what the regulators are going to do. So that's kind of what I was thinking. But you make a really good point. I mean, the whole attack on the crypto banks kind of pushes that theory kind of at least down the road for a bit.
Unfortunately, I think a lot of it is driven by the current administration, or rather, I shouldn't say the administration, but whoever the puppet handlers for Joe Biden and his administration are. I think that there are certain powers that be that are weaponizing elements of the U.S. government, that are weaponizing the regulators against crypto for what I can only really coin as nefarious purposes. It is nefarious. I'm sorry. It's corrupt is what it is. There is no logic in what it is that they're doing. I don't get it. I don't understand it. It's indefensible. in my personal view. Maybe other people feel differently. I don't know. I know nobody in crypto feels the same way that I do. Everyone in crypto feels the same way that I do. But one thing that, I mean, really kind of truly sticks out to me is banks will do anything to make money. That's the point of having a bank at the end of the day. And maybe that changed over in the course of the 20th century, where now a bank is really about having power. And as tech and banks begin to merge with one another, we're already starting to see that, where the major tech companies are coming for banking, and the banking groups are very scared of it. Banks are going to have to inevitably go elsewhere, search elsewhere for high margin financial products, for high margin structured products, for high margin credit lines, etc. And crypto not only offers that potential for high margin lines, but more importantly for me, it offers the opportunity to offer high margin products to what historically has been disenfranchised investors, as well as disenfranchised depositors in emerging economies. And this kind of brings everything back full circle to kind of what we were touching on before, where if we ended up having let's call it an international regulatory environment, where a JP Morgan, because it has more information and has more data, and it has the technology to better offer banking services to Africa, it has better ability to offer banking services to Southeast Asia, to Latin America. I mean, now we're not talking about just having higher margin products for the domiciles the banks are already in. We're talking about high margin products that can be made available to those that would be disenfranchised. We've always talked about banking the unbanked, and shit, wouldn't you know it, crypto, as long as we get over and through the regulatory hurdles, it actually offers us the ability to do that.
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoiners sometimes like to shit on stablecoins, but what Tether and also USDC to an extent are doing, and the way it's being used in emerging markets is, it really is an alternative to banking. Bitcoin's not at the point yet where it's replacing the US dollar, and the US dollar still is the world reserve currency. And if you go to most emerging markets countries, they're very happy to receive dollars, businesses especially. So stable coins, in terms of acting as for cross-border payments for businesses, and also for individuals, it really acts as a good alternative to banking. So if you could see banks starting to adopt, let's just say, stable coins for now, like that could be good business for them. They put on a small margin on every transaction, like they do with everything else. If they can provide a secure product and a secure way for people and businesses to transact, that could be good business. I mean, for the end user, you don't really need the bank. That's the whole point for cryptocurrencies. But that would be another way for banks to kind of get in on that.
And I think that adoption is inevitable. I mean, you see the guys over at Circle. That's quite literally what they are pushing for from an international perspective. They're trying to do this in the United States, and they're getting a lot of pushback. But I also know a lot of the guys that run Circle over here in Europe, and they're actually making a lot of headway with it. And this is where the EU is light years ahead of the United States from a regulatory environment. And that's actually another podcast we should do, Matt. Remind me of that at a later time. But with Mika and actually laying clear regulation, which will evolve over time. What is decided as the regulatory framework today, that will change over time, but at least there's a framework that people understand that they can work within now. And that's what's been missing in the United States. I mean, so I'm not the biggest fan of everything that Coinbase has done in their approach from a regulatory perspective. I mean, there is merit in, there's the old adage, being a startup, right? Which is better, to ask permission or to ask forgiveness after the fact? If you had asked me a couple of years ago, I would have certainly said ask permission. Now I don't agree with that, because we've seen bad actors that you would actually have to ask that permission of. And they have been bad actors. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. So this is where I do think it's better to ask forgiveness, or at least clarify why you do not need to be forgiven. And Coinbase went the ultra conservative approach with this. And while I might not necessarily agree with that, I do think that they did it as by the books as they possibly could. And I do think that is the right play to a certain extent. With that said, it also exposed them because they made everything available. They turned over everything to the SEC, just asking them for any clarity, any guidance on what can we do to do X, Y, and Z. And clearly the SEC was just biding their time, waiting until they could jump in and say, aha, we got you. And Coinbase has no other choice right now but to say, like, you got us with what? We asked you what to do. We asked you to give clarity for what it is that we can and cannot do, and you didn't tell us anything. And now Coinbase is basically upstream without a paddle. I do think that they'll end up winning their lawsuits. I mean, we even just saw recently Binance, which acted in a completely different manner than Coinbase. They just won the first major step in their ongoing legal case that was just brought last week, where Binance US accounts are not frozen. That is a huge win for Binance and probably will, to a certain extent, turn the tide of the Binance and SEC thing. Now, how will this shake out? I don't know. Honestly, I don't think anything will happen until after the 2024 election. This is just going to be an ongoing back and forth between the SEC, Coinbase, and Binance, I believe, up until then. If and when Trump wins, Christ, all bets are off. God knows what the hell the world's going to look like when Trump wins. But if Biden wins, I think that's when shit gets bad for Binance and Coinbase. Because that just further instills Gary Gensler's power. He won't be a pseudo lame duck, kind of like what he might be right now. I mean, you already have Congress kind of coming after him. Congress is now putting legislation forth to completely restructure the SEC, which I'm a huge proponent of. I haven't deep dived into it to comment onto it too much, but it looks like a right first step in the right direction. But I don't know. We'll see. It's going to be a bit of time until we truly see the regulatory clarity that allows that banking type of adoption that you alluded to earlier.
Is there a chance that what's his name, RFK, the young Kennedy guy, that he could replace Biden because he's pro Bitcoin, or is that just probably not going to happen?
As the Democratic main guy, I don't think so.
I mean,
not
Biden
this election, at least.
There's a pretty high chance Biden dies over the course of the next 18 months, if we're being completely honest. The guy's in his 80s. He's in his 80s. I mean, obviously, I don't wish it on the guy, but I mean, he has a hell of a lot higher chance of dying than any of the three of us over the course of the next 18 months, right?
Oh, sure, yeah. I think if he croaks, then definitely RFK's got a shot. But I mean, I don't see him, if Biden's alive and at least coherent, I don't see that being a possibility.
Oh God, I don't even think if Biden is completely delusional, which he might already be.
I would say I don't know if he's currently coherent. So who the hell knows?
Exactly. So I won't even bring coherent into the equation. I think Joe Biden would have to die for RFK to have a shot. I don't see any other way. I could be wrong, but like they're not even letting RFK in the debates. Like, so there will be no Democrat debate at any primary or whatever. The powers that be have decided on Biden the same way the powers that be in the Democrat Party decided on Clinton, even though the entire voting body of the Democrats voted for Bernie Sanders years and years ago. And it was the supermajority holders, or the super voters, or whatever the hell they call them in the Democrat primaries, basically the very select few people that were a part of the Democrat National Party. They were the 400 plus people that overruled the popular vote within the Democrat National Party, which all went to Bernie Sanders. And that's how Clinton got it. I mean, that same power that be within the Democrat Party has decided it's Joe Biden. Which you can't blame him. He's the incumbent. It is very weird to have an incumbent replaced in the primary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also like if once you're president, getting reelected is the chance of getting reelected is much higher than getting a new guy in to get elected, right?
Yeah, I think in terms of guys that have run for 2 terms, there's like only a handful of people that weren't reelected. I would say, I mean,
it's like it's only like 2 or 3 that were the incumbents that weren't reelected, and Trump is now one of them, or something like that. Like I remember, the only one that comes to mind right now though is Grover Cleveland, because he's the guy that lost.
Also anti-Bitcoin.
Yeah. Oh, he was very anti. He was like from the 1840s or something like that, dude.
Yeah, and I guarantee you, he hated digital currency.
He probably hated gold or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, him and Peter Schiff would have gotten along. No, so I think, yeah, so he's the guy that lost and then got reelected again. So he's something like the 22nd and 24th president of the U.S. I don't know. Maybe we'll see history repeat itself this time around. But either way, my view is that the outcome of the 2024 election, Biden v. Trump, which is what it looks like it will be, neither of that is good for Bitcoin. And
I think Trump's getting the Republican nominee.
God, I hope not.
I don't think he will, man. I mean,
I have no clue. I mean, with all of the, I mean, I would hope that DeSantis is able to dethrone him anyway. I would hope that, actually, my favorite is Vivek over on that side. I really love Vivek Ramaswamy, but he's not electable. Nobody knows who the hell he is, so it's not possible. But I mean, unless there really ends up becoming jail time out of this document stuff from Mar-a-Lago, I don't see how it isn't Trump.
Really? I had thought it was going to be Ronnie D the whole time. I mean, to me, there's almost like a schism in like the Republican Party right now from everything I see, and I don't see a lot because I tend to try to, watch sports and play video games instead of watching the news. But from what I see, Ron DeSantis seems to be their poster boy for right now. I mean, Trump, I think, would almost have to run independent or something like that in order to get some sort of vote.
Yeah, but that would so last I saw, which was earlier this week, I think in likely Republican primary voters, take that as you will, because I don't believe in any goddamn poll they put out anymore. But in that poll, and I think it was 538, I read it from. So it's like an independent polling agency. They had Trump at like 64% of the Republican primary.
Man.
And like DeSantis was in the 20s. And then after that, it was at 2%, some guy I'd never heard of. And then like Ramaswamy was at 1% or something like that. And I think they had Nikki Haley in there as well, too, at 1%. The truth is that I just think, I mean, Trump's a wrecking ball. I would rather be DeSantis. I just don't see any other way that it works out, though.
But that sounds overall like whether it ends up being Biden or Trump, that it's going to be pretty difficult for Bitcoin and crypto companies in America in the near future.
I would say yes.
So actually, even worse, I said this a few years ago. So after Biden won the election, I said, look, we have to look to 2028 right now to see when a Bitcoin ETF would be approved. I mean, Alex, you've been around this topic of conversation with me for years now. Everyone's kind of been waiting on that Bitcoin ETF. And you know what? We have Bitcoin futures ETFs, which, by the way, how fun is it that they had like a 10% loss relative to Bitcoin because of Contango? I mean, we all saw that coming if you know anything about how futures trade. But hey, good luck, Gary Gensler, or good job, Gary Gensler. You literally just cost any investor in that 10% versus if you just let a fucking Bitcoin ETF go. But hey, here we are.
Classic Gary.
I mean, you end up in good old Gary. So you end up in a situation where I said it's not going to happen until 2028, and people would ask me why. And I said, well, because Trump's not going to allow it. Whoever Trump appoints as the SEC commissioner won't allow it. And we already know that the Biden administration and Gary are not going to allow it. We're going to have to see a complete change of the administration. We're going to have to see one of these old heads replaced as president, effectively. Appoint a more forward thinking commissioner for there to be a Bitcoin ETF in the United States. And everyone was telling me, no, we'll see it in 23, we'll see it in 24. Nah, I said back in 2020, there's no way in fuck it happens until 28. I mean, it was just inevitable it was going to work out this way, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, like a real Bitcoin ETF would be huge for Bitcoin adoption in America as an investment. And that I think would really push up the price, because then institutions could really start buying in. Retail would probably be all over it, since, you know, Bitcoin tends to perform better than most assets, at least in most years. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's an interesting point. That's an interesting point. I didn't think about that.
Yeah, you have to remember where the politics are. And unfortunately, it hasn't been until very recently that there was any political upside in supporting Bitcoin and crypto in Congress. And this is where we have started to see the tides change a little bit. We have seen certain politicians, we have on both the right and the left, Democrats and Republicans have come out in support of the Bitcoin and the crypto ecosystem, which is absolutely phenomenal to see. But politicians won't put their neck out there for a movement that either A, they don't unequivocally believe in themselves, or B, that won't get them political clout. And we've just started to see that they're recognizing now that there are single issue voters around Bitcoin and crypto. I mean, I might become, for the first time in my life, a single issue voter in this upcoming election. I mean, I've always voted libertarian. I never vote Republican or Democrat, but I mean, I might be a single issue voter on, okay, which party do I think is going to be less worse for Bitcoin and crypto adoption? Because I genuinely think it's just that important. And a lot of political groups are starting to recognize that. And that's why I think you're starting to see the tide turn, and they're starting to adopt positions in and around Bitcoin and crypto. All right. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about the kind of downsides, or rather the risks that are currently threatening Bitcoin, mostly from a political perspective, from an institutional perspective, from a regulatory perspective. And I think a lot of people are already familiar with that. But I mean, even though I might not necessarily think we'll see a Bitcoin ETF until 2028, that doesn't mean that there aren't still some absolutely amazing things that have been developed and are in development in and around the Bitcoin community. I mean, Lightning, for me, for the longest time, Lightning has always kind of been a, well, you know what, I'll believe it when I see it sort of thing. But over the last, I would say, 12 to 18 months, we've really started to see the Lightning Network start to work the way that it has been promised since all the way back in, 2015, 2016 or so. I mean, Alex, you're kind of you're kind of boots on the ground with regards to this. I mean, what are some of the other projects like Lightning, other layer 2 solutions out there that have you most excited over where the future of Bitcoin may be going?
So it's interesting you mentioned Lightning, because I was just in Prague at the BTC Prague Bitcoin conference, and
I'm so upset I wasn't able to get to that.
You definitely missed something. It was really good. A lot of people said it was better than Bitcoin Miami, but I think
Really
it was
now?
also a bit different how it was set up. But there you had the option to either pay with debit card or with Lightning, because there was a Lightning payments company that was doing payments for the entire conference. So the food stalls outside, the cafe area inside, you could pay with Lightning. And I spoke to the barista at one of the coffee stands, and they said like 70-80% of people were paying with Lightning. And I asked them, like, how is it for you? Is it any different than, if people pay with like contactless using their phones or with their debit cards? And for them, it was like, no, it's no different. Like, you just open a different app. It all goes to, into the same POS software. So there you could really see how like easy Bitcoin spending with Lightning works really well. The Wi-Fi was a little wonky, and the connection, because I think so many people were on their phones. So like it wasn't like instant every time, but it definitely worked. And you can see that people use Bitcoin, and that, like you said, Lightning works. One thing that's happening this year is the emergence of Bitcoin ordinal theory, where you can
Mm-hmm.
now inscribe individual sats with data. So we now have NFTs on the Bitcoin blockchain. We've recently also seen the emergence of tokens on the Bitcoin blockchain being minted directly on the Bitcoin blockchain and traded similarly to how tokens could work on Ethereum and these other blockchain. And the result of that is that on-chain transaction fees have gone up. And a lot of people are complaining about that because, if you want to onboard Bitcoin, like what does it mean for Bitcoin's development as a currency if suddenly transaction fees are like a few dollars instead of, being less than $1? And a positive side effect from that can be that people are just going to like get onboarded immediately on Lightning, which in many ways makes more sense if you're looking into emerging markets where their first Bitcoin purchase is probably like $10 or $20 and not like, 1,000 or 2,000, where the
Mm-hmm.
higher transaction fees aren't such a big deal. So with a lot of the stuff that's happening on innovations that are happening on chain that are causing transaction fees to spike, that might see more layer two adoption with Lightning being the go-to one for payments. There are also other second layer solutions coming out. Some of them focused on scalability, and others focused on smart contract functionalities. Stacks is a good example, where you can see sort of a DeFi and also an NFT ecosystem forming there. But there's also entirely new ones coming out that I've only like heard of because they come out like 2 weeks ago. Like Arc is one of them that I'm still looking into properly. But there's a lot happening in the Bitcoin ecosystem, and I feel like there's a lot of people from other blockchains and their communities coming to Bitcoin or coming back to Bitcoin now that there is more happening in the Bitcoin ecosystem. That building on Bitcoin now is really, it's more than just sort of like, building fiat on and off ramps, building wallets, building payment services, but having sort of DeFi solutions being built on or slash secured by Bitcoin, which I think is very interesting. The NFT stuff is always give or take. Some people love NFTs, some people hate them. But if the demand is there, if it brings more people to Bitcoin, it's probably a net positive for Bitcoin. So yeah, this year in many ways it's been really exciting in the Bitcoin ecosystem because so much new stuff has been happening. So many new apps and solutions are being built, and also there's a Noster which came out, which is
Mm-hmm.
an open source protocol to build things like social media networks. And there are a lot of people building on Noster. You don't hear about it as much in mainstream media because there's no big VC funding behind it. But there are dozens of new applications being built on Noster, which uses Lightning. So it's sort of like quasi built on Lightning, which is very interesting because it also shows you new ways to build social networks and other applications. So yeah, I mean, it's really exciting being in Bitcoin at the moment, with all this new stuff happening. The price rallied at the start of this year. I do think that that's a little misleading because we're definitely still in a bear market. Like
Yeah.
I spoke to so many people at BTC Prague. I spoke to a lot of founders and companies either sort of, I wouldn't say struggling to raise funds because there are Bitcoin focused VCs and they are out there funding companies, but like finding the right VCs is something that some founders spoke to me about, and those that have gotten funding are not spending their money aggressively. They're kind of trying to hold on to it, just because they know that fundraising is probably going to be difficult the next sort of 12 months, given where interest rates are. So we're definitely still in a bear market, but as we've seen in the past, in bear markets are great times to build. And as long as your Bitcoin company or your Bitcoin project or your open source project can survive that bear market, then good things are going to happen in the bull market in terms of, not just in terms of the price of Bitcoin, but in terms of user adoption. At the end of the day, like the one thing we all have in common in the Bitcoin community, in the Bitcoin industry, is that we want to push Bitcoin adoption forward because we think that it's going to change the world for the positive.
And I think this is something that is more noteworthy among Bitcoin and the Bitcoin community than, I mean, frankly, just about any other community of any type on earth. I mean, Bitcoiners are really here, not necessarily just to make money. I mean, of course, we all have to pay our bills and we all certainly want to have a Lambo one day. I mean, I'm joking, but of course, a lot of people are out for that. But I mean, what really makes the Bitcoin community unique is the adoption of this ethos, this common mentality that we believe that there is a better alternative source of money out there, that there is a way that we can transact peer to peer without intermediaries meddling in our affairs. And Bitcoin is the only thing that really offers what that potential future could ever look like. It's impossible for us to kind of fathom anything that, I mean, I can't think of another form of money that is even remotely compatible or remotely could ever be something more superior to what Bitcoin is. And of course, maybe a couple of years ago, I probably wouldn't have thought anything was better than the US dollar until Satoshi constructed what Bitcoin is today. Well, not just Satoshi, but Satoshi wrote the white paper and then a community built Bitcoin. But for me, it's really a mission that a whole bunch of people are on together, regardless of what money we maybe or maybe not will ever be able to make out of it.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's also what differentiates Bitcoin from a lot of the other kind of crypto communities, where there's in a lot of the sort of altcoin communities, there's a lot of sort of get rich quick and make as much money as you possibly can, and that kind of fast capitalism. But in Bitcoin, much like the development of the Bitcoin software, it's sort of slow and steady and working together towards a common goal. And that's also sort of something that I really felt when I was at the conference. I mean, there's different people from, all different walks of life and different, different areas on the political spectrum, but everyone is there to push Bitcoin forward because everyone believes that Bitcoin has the potential to make the world a better place.
So as we kind of come to the end of our time here together, Alex, what is the one thing that has you most excited about Bitcoin moving forward this year?
Honestly, I would say the adoption of the Lightning Network. And the reason why is because I want Bitcoin to succeed as money. When I first started, when I was freelancing and I had my first Bitcoin client and I was getting paid in Bitcoin, I wasn't able to hold on to it. It was like I didn't buy Bitcoin as an investment and just hodl it. For me, it was always money. Like I got paid in it. I used it to buy things where I could pay with Bitcoin, and I converted it into local currency when I needed to. So for me, like I always like what I love about Bitcoin is that it's money outside of the state. That was the case when I first came across it, when I first purchased it, and when I started using it. So for me, seeing the Lightning Network kind of re-enable the sort of low-cost, high-speed transactions that we had, back in the early days of Bitcoin when that still worked on-chain, I think that's great. And the fact that a lot of people are being onboarded immediately onto layer 2 now, at a much lower cost, and just seeing how fast you can send like Bitcoin payments around the world just like that. That's what I'm most excited about right now.
Well, that certainly got me excited too. It's fantastic to see the Lightning community start to really and truly deliver on the promises that they made all those years ago. I'm personally excited for it. I know Matt's excited for it. Just look how excited the layperson is over there.
It all sounds good to me, guys.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for joining us, Alex. It's always a pleasure. We're going to have to make sure we get you back on the show sometime. And next time you make it over to a Bitcoin event like in Prague, you'll have to let me know.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on the Proof of Words podcast.
Thank you very much.